and we'll kind of see how it works. So that's a little bit of my background, kind of what I do separately from speaking. And so I'm not sure how much you know about my talk or whatever. So I'm going to start, and I want to thank you too, because we were scheduled for February, and then it was kind of nasty weather and several people were sick. I happened to be sick at the same time. So I'm glad we got to reschedule and have much nicer weather, and I could be here and all of that. So thank you for having me. I want to start with a question. Have you ever experienced a game changer in your life? So yeah, a game changer could be loss of a job, change of a job, could be a severe illness, could be, I even say retirement is a game changer, because we're looking at that ourselves, and even having kids can be a game changer, right? So a lot of times when we know a game changer is happening or coming in the near future, we don't necessarily do a lot to what I call prevent, be proactive, and be prepared. And we think we are, but we don't really know how much we are with the 3 Ps, the prevention, the proaction, and being prepared. So I want to start with the story of our journey. And so my husband in November of 2015 was diagnosed with an acoustic neuroma, and that is a life-threatening brain tumor. Benign, so nothing to worry about the cancer side of things. And we had 4 months to prepare. From his diagnosis to his first surgery, which was March 10th of 2016, we had 4 months to prepare. It was a very kind of nerve-wracking time. It's not like an emergency where you go right into surgery or anything like that. We had 4 months to really think and a lot about all of the ramifications. So my husband's first surgery went from a 6-hour surgery to a 12-hour surgery, and he ended up with complications from it. So the complications were that he lost his facial nerve. So that meant he looked like he had a very severe stroke. Severe stroke. And so they had transplanted a nerve out of his foot, super glued it in his head, and 4 days later he came home. And we were dealing with just a 3 to 6 week recovery at that point, with a few complications, nothing that couldn't be handled. And so we were kind of getting back to life with a new normal with that. And then 10 days later, my husband was complaining of a headache. And it's like, what's the headache? I thought he had overdosed on oxycodone because he had taken 2 in the time frame of an hour. We're not familiar with narcotics, what does that look like? And so needless to say, he ended up back in the neuro ICU over at University Hospital. And so I want to pick up the story right there. So we were back at University Hospital, and I was sitting in the waiting room, and it was one of those typical spring blizzards where you can't see the building, next door, you can't see across the street. And had literally just had the thought, I'm glad I'm here and not out there and not trying to get home. And my phone rang. And so it was one of the doctors asking for consent for a second emergency brain surgery. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what does this really mean? And so I said, I'm right down the hall. So as you can imagine, I went running down the hallway to his room and immediately observed 7 medical professionals in his room. And when you have that many people in your room, things are very serious. They were prepping him for surgery. I was talking to the doctor, finding out about the consent. And so he was telling me what was going on. So what had happened is my husband had intracranial pressure with a score of 55. You and I have 4, 5, 6 on an average everyday basis, and they wanted him below 20. So he was literally off the charts at 55. So the emergency brain surgery was necessary. And so I signed that consent form, and that was the first of 21 consents that I would give for his medical care. So they whisked him off to surgery. 3 hours later, I was talking to the neurosurgeon, the department head of neuro ICU, and his right-hand man, and learning, what are the consequences? What are we dealing with? And so we were dealing with a 2% chance of surviving. He had bacterial meningitis, but it was called gram-negative. It was a gut bacteria that migrated to his head. They don't know how or why that happened. And so that was just one of the things he was suffering from. He had ventriculitis, so is the ventricles, the circulation in your brain, and he had hydrocephalus. So hydrocephalus is water on the brain. And 14 of them had never seen this situation before. And they're like, we don't know, of all things, we can probably get the bacterial meningitis under control. We don't know about the other two. And they said, he's got a 2%. And that kind of knocks you back a little bit when you hear a 2%. Some people say, I had cancer, I had a 70% chance of surviving or treatment or whatever. And it's like, when you're at 2%, you're at the cusp. Yeah. So I literally, as a fiercely positive person that I am, I literally said to them, this is you all's expertise. You can figure it out. If it takes all of you, it takes all of you. And I'll do this quick diversion really quickly. When he picked his surgical team, they commented, if anything goes wrong, you have an entire neurosurgical department to take care of you. Little did we know we would need the entire neurosurgical department to take care of him. So my husband was in a coma. And so he went into a coma for 32 days. And during that time frame, you really don't know, one, if they'll survive, how they will survive, and what that's going to look like. And so I told them, you all figure it out. I'll be here to be the supporting spouse. I'll be here to make the decisions that need to be made. And I will be here to talk to him and have one-sided conversations, because that's one thing that they told me. They're like, every time you're here, you talk to him and you touch him. And I'm like, okay, got it. So 32 days he was in a coma, and then he started coming out of the coma. Nurses were ecstatic. And I'm like, okay, I had to then shift. And it's like, what does this mean for me? Because up to that time, he was being taken care of. So, okay, at what point does this care shift to me? And what does that look like? Well, when he was coming out of the coma, then I learned that I had to make decisions for rehabs and so on and so forth. And it was 6 weeks of rehabs, 2 rehabs, because he had to relearn how to walk and relearn how to eat and swallow, because the loss of that facial nerve affected that as well. And so, 6 weeks in rehab, and yay, June 1st, he got to come home. And, everybody's excited, this is great. And I'm like, okay, this is a lot that has completely shifted to me at home. And at the time, I was still working full time. I was managing a business in Cherry Creek, and I was working half days because of just the situation. And I had gone on Family Medical Leave Act, and I had gotten my husband on Family Medical Leave Act as well. And so he's home, he's starting to realize what's gone on, started asking the 50,000 questions, and me filling in the gaps and filling all that in for him. And so the good news is, obviously, he survived, number one. He's thriving, and a lot of people assume he doesn't work or anything like that. He's back to as much normal as he could possibly be. It was just a couple of months after that he was back to work. Well, about a month after he came home, he was back to work. A couple months after that, he was back to driving. And he literally is what they call a miracle, because they had never seen it before, and he became the ENT and the neurosurgeon's poster patient, literally, because it was the first time they had had success in doing the gluing of the transplant of the nerve into a head, and actually had nerve regeneration happen. So he was home. We were kind of dealing with the new lifestyle. What does this look like? We had therapists coming in and out all the time. I was running off to work, doing all this and that. And then, it kind of dawned on me. I was the loved one, I was the primary care provider, and I was the health advocate, all wrapped into one. And I was making all major decisions, whether it was our household, whether it was our work situations, or whether it was his medical care. We were very fortunate in the fact that he had a very supportive work environment. Steve's retired Air Force, he was working for the Department of Defense. The HR people were very supportive, and he got several hundreds of hours donated to him. And so we were very fortunate for that. And in the midst of this, he comes home with 22 medications. Well, we set about getting him off as many medications as we could. And we literally took him down to 0. Within a couple months, he was down to 0, and I'm proud to say he's still at 0. And they're amazed at that he doesn't need any medications. He doesn't even have headaches, which is interesting. And so I really realized that during this time, I was kind of learning a lot on the fly, because nobody really knows what to expect in the healthcare system. You kind of know, you've heard stories from various people, and then when you're in the throes of it and having to make major decisions, I learned a lot about what we had missed in those 4 months of prep time. And I say, we're a smart, intelligent couple, and we missed a lot. We didn't get our T's crossed and our I's dotted. We were fortunate in the fact that because of when Steve was diagnosed, it was during open enrollment. And he said to me, he goes, I'm just gonna change my health insurance at work just in case anything goes wrong. So there were a lot of God winks in that story. And so that's the title of my book, God Winks and Miracles Happen. It's a story of love, faith, and hope, because of all the little God winks that now I see that were happening. And at the time I was just grateful that little things had happened and he had made certain decisions and stuff. So that's why I put the whole story, you get the whole story in the book. You learn about how he even ended up getting diagnosed, which is because of me, the nagging wife. And so anyway, so here we were, smart, intelligent people, and I was dealing with this. My husband's in a coma, who knows what. There were things I was remembering and things I wasn't remembering in regards to, our finances, our legal rights, and everything. So I had been a health coach for many years up to that point. And so at this point, we were dealing with getting him off of medications. What was everything going to look like? What was his recovery? So previously with his first surgery, his recovery was 3 to 6 weeks. We had now gone to 3 to 10 years of a recovery. They said 3 to 5 to begin with, but then on follow-up appointments, they're like, yeah, we're going to follow you for 10 years. So they literally are following him for 10 years, which also helps them because University Hospital is a teaching hospital. That information they can then use as a follow-through on their studies. And so I learned a lot on the fly, learned about protecting your assets, and because I have a health background, your health is your number one asset. A lot of people think that your house or your car is. If you don't have this, you don't get to enjoy anything else in life. So I learned a lot about finances, and I learned about legal rights. And so what I did after this whole experience, and about a year and a half later, you kind of realize everything you've learned. And so I put it all down on paper. And so I created what is, I call it a Cover Your Assets checklist. And it's the very bare basics. And I will send around the sign-up sheet here in a moment. And this is yours. This is yours to have. Because I put down the basics, even though I know you're in insurance and there's financial advisors and stuff out there, but so many times we don't remember those things. We don't remember what we need to change or take care of before we know a major game changer is going to happen. And so I just started writing down the different and taking notes. And then I'm like, I did not go through this just to sit on all this information. I didn't experience all of this in order to not share it with people. And so that's why I speak, is because I'm out there really getting the message out and reminding you and refreshing your memory of certain things that need to happen. Because I'm a believer that it's not a matter of if, but when. You'll either by emergency, by accident, or by medical care of choice be in our healthcare system, and really need to know how to protect yourself and be prepared. So I'm going to send around the checklist, or the sign-up sheet, and if you want it, it is this sheet. It comes to you via email, and I do that on purpose because I want you to share it with someone else. Share it with other loved ones, family members. It also is a great way to have a conversation, because these are difficult decisions and these are difficult conversations to have. Because Steve was in the Air Force, we had to make decisions previously about, do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried in a casket? Those kinds of things. That's not included here. But there are difficult decisions, and that family members kind of tend to go like this until, oh my gosh, it's got to happen now. And so I want to just go through, this is like the 30,000 foot view of my checklist. What I offer is a complimentary strategy session to help people go through the checklist, check off those things that you've got done, and figure out what your next best step is. And it touches on lifestyle too, because as you can imagine, our lifestyle got changed, and everybody's lifestyle changes. And so oftentimes we forget about the lifestyle part, and we kind of deal with the serious, I call them external things, because I'll get to some internal things in a bit. And I know all of you are business owners, right? And my question is, can you afford to get sick? When you get sick, whether it's a common cold or flu, that's 2 to 3 weeks that you're out, or if it's a serious diagnosis, can your business really afford for you to have the downtime or the away time? And can it take a financial hit? Does your income dramatically get impacted? So the 30,000 foot view is wellness, health items. And so health insurance, obviously, most people know you need to have health insurance, right? I call that sick insurance, because it really only kicks in when you're sick, right? And backup insurance. I already commented that my husband was able to change insurance coverage at his office, at his work. That proved to be tremendously helpful, because he had 3 medical transports to the tune of several thousands of dollars. And then here's the other thing is, it doesn't hurt to look and see if your coverage covers rehab facilities. Rehab facilities are different than long-term care facilities. And so I know, what is it, Lori. So you're a financial advisor.
And life insurance.
Yeah, life insurance. So I'm not, and so I always say that I'm not, but you need to make sure you have these things covered. Your financial advisor covers it. Sometimes at work, depending if you're in the military, you cover it. But then other people just kind of hope that nothing serious ever happens. On the health side, I always talk about, what are you doing to fill in your nutritional deficiencies in your daily life? Because no matter what diet, no matter what diagnosis you might have, if you're gluten-free, celiac, there are gaps in our nutrition that you need to fill. And so I call that the true health insurance, because when you filled the gaps, then you've got as much what I would call full coverage for yourself. Know your numbers. This is a key thing. Dr. Oz talks about it. I talk about it, because the story is, by knowing your numbers, you can advocate for yourself, whether it's a general checkup with your doctor, and all of a sudden your blood pressure is off the charts and they want to give you blood pressure medication. This literally happened to me, and my blood pressure was off the charts, and I'm like, that's not my normal. And they wanted to give me blood pressure medication, and I'm like, I'm not taking it. Don't even bother. So you really need to know those numbers to advocate for yourself. And I always say to create a new health habit, whatever that might be. Maybe that's walking the dog, doing a little more movement each day. For some people, they need to reduce alcohol consumption just a little bit. I'm not saying cut it all out, but there is a misnomer that, wine every day, you have to have 100 glasses of red wine in order to have a health benefit a day. And so, yeah, so anyways, I don't say don't do those, but just be consciously aware of how that's impacting your health. And then also with that, achieve your best optimal weight as possible. I'm working on that. I went through surgery just a few months ago, and I was down. I was down for like 4 weeks that turned into 8 weeks. And so you just never know how your weight will impact your health as well. So moving to finances, I already mentioned I'm not a financial advisor, but it's very important for you to have your income protected as much as possible, for you to have access to cash. And we were very lucky. Steve's bills were over $5 million. It was $85,000 a day in neuro ICU just for the bed. That did not include the doctors or the medications, the therapists, the specialists. And so you hear those stories, and it's true, especially when you need the specialists and you need the care, the intense care that he needed. And so we were very lucky with everything we had planned on the financial side. We ended up with about a $300 out of pocket, which was, grand scheme of things, that's nothing. Steve was able to, because he's retired Air Force, he was through the VA. The VA does not do brain surgeries, thank God. And so he was able to pick and choose his surgical team. So he picked the best in town, best in the region, actually. And that proved, tremendously helpful. I already mentioned access to cash, know your rights. How do you protect your credit cards? How do you protect your credit reports when all this stuff is going on? So that's a financial aspect. The legal rights is something that you've all heard of. Who here has a will? Do you have a will? You have kids?
Just 6 of them. They'll be fine.
So you want a will. This is nothing you haven't already heard before. You want a will, but when does a will kick in?
When you're dead.
Yeah, when you're dead. So you want a power of attorney for your personal business, and you want a medical power of attorney for medical decisions. So I don't know how old your kids are, but if there are people in your immediate family or your circle of friends, and if they have kids 18 years of age or older still living in their home, they have no way to make medical decisions for that child, even though they're an adult. Because they've reached adulthood, they're living at home, and they're like, but I'm their parent. And I'm like, if they can't make the decision themselves, you don't get to make it either, the doctors do. And so when I learned this, I shared it with a friend of mine whose daughter was going off to college in Kansas. And I'm like, do you have medical power of attorney on her? And she's like, no, why? So I shared why. It's like, if she has a car wreck and she can't make a decision, you're out of luck. And it's like, thanks to the HIPAA law, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, it's because of the HIPAA. So here's the other thing. If you have a will and you have powers of attorney, great. Do you know where they are? Do you have 24/7, 365 access? Because that's the key. So we had them. I did not remember where they were. They were in the safety deposit box at the bank, which you do not have 24/7, 365 access to. I did not remember they were stapled to the will. The JAG on base had prepared ours and had literally stapled them to the will. Well, I paged through and I'm like, this is just the will, not thinking I had the durable and the medical power of attorney there. So I ended up in 18th Judicial Court getting guardianship and conservatorship of my husband. And I got that on Friday, May 13th. I say Friday the 13th. the judge literally said to me, do you realize the amount of responsibility that you're asking for? And I'm like, I've already got it. I just need the legal paperwork to let me do it. And we were fortunate in the fact that because when Steve went in for his first surgery, he had told University Hospital that I was the one making the decisions. So when he ended up back at University Hospital, they just carried that through. And so, you know, that's important too, because he was conscious, obviously, when he went in for surgery and could make that decision.
May I interject on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
You both were lucky that they continued it, because that doesn't happen.
I know.
So, just so everybody knows.
God wink.
So exactly, a God wink. I assumed I had it, I went with it. I didn't have proof of my medical power of attorney. I was waiting for the guardianship and conservatorship to come through, and that took a while. That took about a month to come through. And here's the interesting thing, they interviewed my husband when he was recovering from a coma. And they're like, do you know where you are? Can you make decisions for yourself? He couldn't do all that. He couldn't walk, you know, he couldn't talk, he had a trach, everything. So, you know, I happened to show up at the time they were interviewing, and so, I mean, that was a nice $250 expense for the court to send somebody to his room to discover that he couldn't really make decisions for himself. So, anyways, with the Cover Your Assets checklist, it also covers lifestyle. So our lifestyle didn't change dramatically, but there's little shifts and things that change. When you lose your facial nerve, you lose your ability to balance and have equilibrium. So we had to relearn that. We could no longer bike ride. You know, energy and stamina issues became very important, a really big issue for him. It took about a year from his first surgery to when he went back to work. It took a year to work up to the point where he could drive into work all day and drive home, but he would come home exhausted. So now here we are 3 years later, almost to the day, we're just starting to figure out some of those issues of the energy and stamina, which is lack of oxygen. So I always say, how do you define your life? How do you define lifestyle? What is a dream? What is a big event? What is maybe a big trip you want to take? So that's what my Cover Your Assets checklist goes over. It's the basics. But when I talk to people on the phone and we kind of delve into what you really have going on, we can very specifically say, okay, this is your next step. This is what you want to do. And that's the key thing. You don't want a major drama or trauma like this to give up your own dreams. My dreams changed. I quit my job last year. You know, there were certain things. Reality hits you smack dab in the face. And so, you know, we're in our 50s, and it's like, okay, we're halfway through life. What do we want? So we've made several decisions based on that. We no longer want a 2-story household, we want a single-story household. You know, those kinds of things. So I've talked a lot about the prevention on the health, being prepared and protecting your assets. And so I also want to talk a little bit, those are kind of external things that happen that you just kind of need to take care of and know all that. I want to talk a little bit about internal things, meaning the mind, the body, and the soul. So I was lucky in the fact that I had already been working on some of these things myself when this major event happened. And I was able to, what I would call, for the mind part, be mindful of what was going on and live in the present. So I got really good at writing in a gratitude journal. You know, and I mentioned earlier that I'm kind of fiercely positive, so I was writing down only the things that were working. Instead of, because that's what you want to focus on, and that's what the universe brings back to you, is when whatever you focus on, it brings back to you. So I focused only on things that were working. And I was living in the present. It was very hard for me to meditate, but I would be very mindful of what was going on. And I started setting boundaries. So I always mention that to people. You know, when you're on the internal part of your work, you need to set boundaries. And that can be over a variety of different things. And taking care of your mind is important in the fact that we now have Alzheimer's and dementia. That's a rising disease and rising diagnoses. And when you're in extreme and stress and overwhelm situations, you want to take care of your stress and overwhelm because of how that can impact your health down the road. We all live in stress every day. You drive down the road, you almost get in an accident, that's kind of instant stress. But that's quickly manageable. But when you have long-term stress and you end up with PTSD, because everyone here could end up with PTSD. So the mind is very important because you want to take care of your cognitive function. The body. So I've mentioned already under the checklist that you want to do more movement. And I'm not an advocate of going out and taking a CrossFit class if that's not you. If your thing is walking the dog around the block, around the neighborhood, going to the dog park, doing something of a 20 to 30 minute status every day. And so that's important for the body. The other thing that's important for the body, I've already mentioned, is knowing your numbers. And I'll take this to the next step, is that when you know your numbers for what I call Western medicine, that's great. You're talking your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your triglycerides, that's important to know. But you also need to know what I call for Eastern medicine. What are your vitamin D levels? What's your magnesium levels? I even say know what your eye pressure levels are, because when you know all of that, you can really advocate for yourself, and you know when things are going wrong or right. The other thing I mention is I mentioned before about filling the gaps. I have my entire life taken vitamins and supplements, and I prefer that over the-counter medications and drugs, because here's the difference. When you can be proactive with those, you get side benefits versus side effects. You've all heard the commercials where it's the 30-second commercial and a minute of the disclaimer. Yeah. So it's very important to do that, and not all vitamins and supplements are created equal. That's the big important thing to note. And so then with the soul connections are very important in good times and in bad. A group like this, you have your colleagues here, you have friends and family, neighbors, co-workers who can help support you in good times and bad. The other soul connection that I mentioned too is your healthy and your unhealthy relationships. So we probably all know who our healthy relationships are. Do you know who your unhealthy relationships are? And so I outright give you permission to do something with your unhealthy relationships, because you don't have time to deal with that. Life is too short. We've all heard that. That said, you don't have time to deal with that. We've eliminated a few people from our lives just because it's a lot. It's intense to be around them. They drag down your energy. Yeah.
Even if they're blood relatives.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Because there's just too many other things to experience than to deal with that. That's my opinion. and you just lose a lot of energy, And then I also say, when you're taking care of your soul, some people have the faith community, the faith family, or a spiritual practice, which is great. I also say journal a lot. Some people tell me I don't write. I'm like, you don't have to write, do bullet points. I did 3 bullet points a day or 5 bullet points a day, whatever that looks like. And then I like to say schedule a vacation. Because when you've been taking care of somebody and you're in the heat of it, whatever it is, even for women, we take care of the kids, you name it, you need time away to take care of yourself. So that's that internal part where I mentioned take care of yourself. So here's an interesting statistic. Harvard conducted a study and related major disease such as cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's and dementia, and weight, to stress and overwhelm. 80% of doctors' visits today are related to stress and overwhelm. So, what can you do to be proactive? We've talked a lot about that, right? You can reduce the stress and overwhelm. You can take care of your mind, body, and soul. You can go through the checklist, take care of all the external things. We can get on a call together and talk about, strategy session, and figure out what's the next best step for you, because I love supporting you on your next step. Take care of this. This is here. We had 4 months to prepare for my husband's surgery. We had a 10-minute conversation when I went in. 10 minutes. Honey, here's where the life insurance stuff is. Here's where the will and powers of attorney are. They're no longer in the bank, by the way. and stuff. We had a 10-minute conversation, good to go. Then you can deal with the other stress and nervousness that's going on. And so so you can do the strategy session with me, and I'm just here to support you and to help you take that next step. You've all heard information is power. The next part of that is if power doesn't work unless you take action. So I'm here to support you in that next step. I'm glad to be here and talk to you today. And I have my book available if you want to purchase my book. I'm going to pass these around too. You can have one of my flyers that talks about the different things that I offer. And thank you for having me. I'm glad I was able to make it. And I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any questions.
You're amazing. How old was your husband when this happened?
He was 51. He's 55 now.
What
Yeah.
area do you live in?
Highlands Ranch.
Mm.
Yeah. So I'm close. I'm about 20 minutes away from right here.
And can you tell me exactly what his diagnosis,
So his first surgery was acoustic neuroma.
which is?
What had happened is he was starting to lose his hearing, and I was the nagging wife, repeating myself 4 and 5 times.
Okay.
And, he would look right at me, ask me a question, I'd respond, and he wouldn't hear it.
Okay.
And so when he retired from the Air Force, they said he will need hearing aids at some point, and I'm like, you need to go get hearing aids now,
Right.
before we end up in divorce. I mean, seriously. I mean, it was getting that bad. The other thing I noticed is when we were walking through the neighborhood, he would step off the curb and just kind of wobble a little bit,
Oh.
and it was no big deal. Now we know what it was. So the acoustic neuroma is a tumor on the acoustic nerve in your head. Right
Okay.
there, it runs right there. And so that's when 4 radiology tests and an MRI later discovered the tumor that was about that big.
Okay.
There was no more room in his head for the tumor to grow.
Got
Some people get diagnosed with acoustic neuroma and they watch it. They figured it had been growing 15 years. Slow growth, benign.
it. Right.
To this day, they're benign, but they're starting to occur more and more. And they don't know how they happen. How it gets started. So that acoustic nerve was wrapped around his facial nerve, sitting on his brain stem.
Got it.
So when they took the acoustic nerve, they took the facial nerve, and they were dealing with the brain stem.
Okay.
And the reason they